The Hidden Praise of Addiction, featuring Elizabeth F.S. Roberts. Medical anthropologist and author Elizabeth F.S. Roberts joins the Talking Addiction Recovery podcast to discuss her thought-provoking book, In Praise of Addiction, How We Can Learn to Love Dependency in a Damaged World. Drawing on years of research in Mexico City, Roberts explores a radically different way of understanding addiction, not as the opposite of connection, but as a form of connection itself. She examines how cultural beliefs about independence, self-control, and dependency shape the way we think about substance use, recovery, and human relationships. In this conversation, we discuss how the meaning of addiction has changed throughout history, the difference between addiction and vice in Mexican cultural perspectives, why shame and isolation often worsen addiction-related harms, how American individualism influences treatment and recovery approaches, what soda consumption in Mexico can teach us about addiction, why dependency may be a universal human experience, and the role of community, belonging, and connection in recovery. This episode challenges many commonly held assumptions about addiction and offers a fresh lens for clinicians, people in recovery, family members, and anyone interested in understanding human behavior more deeply.
This is Talking Addiction and Recovery, the podcast talking, you guessed it, all about addiction and recovery. Join your host, licensed professional counselor Andrew J. Schreier, as he and his guests break down recovery topics with raw honesty, delving into niche conversations around the topics of substance abuse, mental health, and gambling. We intend to meet individuals where they are on their own personal journey of recovery, with dignity, respect, and compassion. We'll do more than talk addiction and recovery. We'll explore it. We're glad you've joined us. Here with today's episode, your host, Andrew Schreier.
Our guest on this podcast is Elizabeth F.S. Roberts, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan and the author of In Praise of Addiction, How We Can Learn to Love Dependency in a Damaged World, and God's Laboratory, Assisted Reproduction in the Andes. Since 2013, she has participated in collaborative environmental health research in Mexico City. She, along with many family members, has struggled with addiction. You can learn more about Elizabeth F.S. Roberts in the podcast notes. Before we get into today's episode, if you're a licensed or certified behavioral health professional, I want to make sure you know about something that could save you time, money, and maybe even a vacation day. Talking Addiction Recovery is now an approved continuing education provider through IPGGC, NASW Wisconsin chapter, and NADAC, meaning you can earn CEUs just by listening to select podcast episodes and completing a short post-test. No conference, no webinar registration, no membership, no paid platform. Just the content you're already consuming, working for your professional development. Head over to www.andrewjschreier.com/continuing-education for everything you need. All right, let's get into today's episode. On this episode of Talking Addiction and Recovery podcast, I want to welcome Elizabeth F.S. Roberts. Thanks for joining.
Hi, Andrew. I'm really excited to be here.
We're going to dive into your book, which I'm super excited to talk about, In Praise of Addiction. But before we do, can you give listeners a little bit of a background about yourself?
Yes, I'm an anthropologist. I'm a medical anthropologist, and what that means is I think about how people experience health and bodies and diseases. And I, in particular, do that in Mexico City. And I've been working there for a long time, and I do work with environmental health researchers, mostly about chemical exposure. And when I was doing this long-term research I do with them in neighborhoods in Mexico City is where I started to realize that my neighbors were teaching me about this whole other way that they do and live addiction. And that's why I wrote this.
That was amazing. Yeah, when we talk about your book, In Praise of Addiction, or How We Can Learn to Love Dependency in a Damaged World, first of all, that title has just got to catch people. Like, it's got to give them like a second glance, because we often don't use praise in addiction. And even early on in the book, you talk about one of the things that we do hear all the time is the opposite of addiction is connection. But the neighbors where you were turned this mantra on its head. Addiction is not the opposite of connection. Addiction is connection. Where do you even begin to have a conversation with people? Because it is like turning a lot of what we hear about addiction upside down.
Yeah, I love you pointing out the title. It was a controversial title to get through the press. And a lot of people in my life, as I was writing it, were like, that's a great title. It's going to draw people in. And people at the press, I think rightly so, were worried that it is a title that would really turn people off because addiction's been such a hard, devastating, damaging thing in their lives or the lives of their loved ones. So it's kind of a gamble. Is it going to like draw people in or turn them off and make them not want to read the book? And I hope it's more of the first. It's good for me, obviously. But I also hope I can have conversations with people who it might be a real turnoff to, and that they might stick around and hear what I have to say. And right, as you say, where do you begin? It's not something we usually think about as praiseworthy. And what I'm doing is a few things. I'm really talking about my neighbors in Mexico City who definitely praise addiction for holding them with other people, for bringing them together in their kind of compulsive, not being able to be in control of themselves in relation to substances and behaviors and doing that with other people. And I have a lot more to say about that. But I think there's also, it's always useful to talk about how the word addiction, when it moved into the English language in the 1500s, it basically meant devotion. It meant an exalted experience of not having control of yourself in relation to something bigger to yourself. And that could have been, biblical scholarship or praising God or drinking a lot with your drinking buddies in a military regiment. And so it didn't really come to be until about the 19th century that we started pathologizing this thing we call addiction. And so there's a long history to addiction being associated with praise in this devotional way.
There's so many words in this book that I'm a big person on how we speak matters. And
Mhm,
I've really
mhm.
learned to, we might know how to speak a language, but it doesn't mean we actually understand it. And so when I read your book and I saw words, like compulsive, compulsion, addiction, dependency, vice, these are all things that I'm used to hearing when it comes to substances. And then even like later on through your book, the chapters, the titles about them, attachment, devotion, ravishment, replacement. I thought it was like taking a course on understanding language and diving deeper into what these mean because we do use all these words to describe substances and other types of behavior. And here you are really breaking them down in ways. And I don't know if that was, I want to tie that into your your position, medical anthropologist. I can't tell you how many books I've read about substance use, gambling, treatment, recovery, whether it's lived experience, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a clinician. I don't have a lot that have been written. I have one now that was written by a medical anthropologist. So part of it to me, it wasn't just the title that won me over, but it was also, okay, here's someone that this is a completely different perspective. And I want to hear from someone who isn't coming from it from how a lot of other people do or how I've heard so many other people speak about it. So I just want to tie all that in and how do you break down all the words that are used? Because I don't hear dependency as much as I used to anymore. It seems like we're considering that a, a not a good word to use. And then you use vice, which I think so many people can identify as like having a vice. Someone's like that doesn't seem as shameful to have a vice, but then if I were to say I have an addiction to something or a dependency on something, it's so different. So how did you even put all of these words to sit down and break them all through and go through them to talk about this topic?
Thank you for asking that because it gives me a little platform to talk about what anthropology is. And anthropologists are doing often is they're learning about how people live in the world and organize themselves in the world in ways that is probably pretty different than maybe the readers of and anthropology, then knows there's this subject position we assume. Anthropology started out as this American, Euro-American thing, and they were going, and anthropologists were usually folks from Europe or the United States, and they were going in other places. And that has changed a lot, like who anthropologists are, that has really changed. What we do is we try to understand the world from the positionality of the people that we're hanging out with. And I'm saying it in a purposefully kind of casual way. You go and you spend long periods of time with people. And what I think is so powerful about anthropology is it shows us that the things that make sense to us, our common sense, what we think is natural and normal, isn't that way for people around the world. Like people live in all these other ways. What's normal for us is not normal for them. What's normal for them is not normal for us. And it doesn't mean that there actually is a right way. What it does mean is we can use this understanding to think about, well, are we sure we want the way we do it to be the way that we do it? And that's pretty much what I'm trying to do by taking my neighbor's experience of addiction that they shared with me, where they find addiction to be a positive phenomenon and experience, and try to think about what that might mean for those of us in the United States who have had so many struggles with addiction, whether it's our loved ones' struggles or people around those around us struggles. Um, and I don't think we can translate or move, the whole scale of what I learned in Mexico over to the United States because we live in really different worlds. I think it's very powerful to try to notice how seeing it differently helps us see what the assumptions are that we've built into something like addiction. And one of the big things that I'm trying to do in the book is show that in the United States, we've had a several hundred years kind of um, reinforcement over and over again that dependency is something that is not okay. That we're ashamed of, that we want to, dissociate ourselves from. We don't want to be dependent on welfare. We don't want, when you grow up, you're supposed to be independent. You're supposed to be, separate from your parents. You're supposed to be successful on all these ways. We really hope that we can become rugged individuals that aren't dependent on the government, for instance. And that is really not how so many people organize themselves around the world. The United States, I would say, has a particular set of anxieties and hatreds of dependency. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to get us to examine how this deep-seated fear and hatred of dependency really plays into how we experience addiction, how we treat people who we label as addicts, whether it's other people or ourselves. And that possibly, if we kind of thought more about why we think dependency is such a problem, we might actually be able to diffuse some of the fear and anxiety we have around addiction itself. I'm not saying, and this is, I always want to be really careful to say this, I am not saying that there are no addictions or dependencies on chemical substances that aren't harmful or damaging. But what I am trying to say is that by automatically assuming that every dependency on a substance or behavior is harmful, we're really doing ourselves a disservice. And I think we're also causing a lot of the damage of addiction comes from the way that we shame people for addictions, including ourselves.
And this is a question that I have in here, which I think really relates to what you're talking about is in this. I wanted to ask you, is it the substance and behavior or the culture that causes isolation?
Right,
Because we often talk about how, like, well, if if you're getting heavily involved in this, like, you become isolated from people, and part of it is like, is that directly because the substance use, separates you, or the behavior separates you, or is it because of how that behavior or substance is seen, then
exactly.
people isolate you, or you isolate because of how you think people may respond or treat you. So to me, like that was my question about, is it really the substance itself or the behavior, or is it the culture that creates that isolation?
I mean, I'm not so much what the book is about. And maybe it would be useful to just give a story, two stories from the book that helps explain. So, in the book, I talk about this moment where I move into this household in Mexico City, and it's called you can call them a terreno. It's like a family compound. Like there's 3 or 4 generations live in terrenos usually. So from great grandparents on down to great grandchildren. And I moved into this one, and I had my own little house within this larger family compound. And one morning, my landlady starts knocking on my window begging for alcohol. And I was kind of panicked and didn't know what to do. And then things happen, including the 5-year-old granddaughter giving him some tequila, which kind of surprised me. But then later on, his wife comes and talks to me and said I'm probably stressed. And it's sort of like, well, Clemente, her husband, is a vice, not an addict like me. I'm an addict because I'm addicted to alcohol, but he has a vice. And for her, what I ended up learning was vice means he's someone that takes himself off and is by himself when he drinks. And that was the definition this is what I learned was this distinction that my neighbors made between addiction and vice. Addiction is a compulsive devotion that holds you with other people. So she was an addict because she drinks with other people. And vices are things that for some inexplicable reason people isolate themselves. And so I didn't quite grasp what she was telling me at the time, but the big thing I did grasp that what happened when I said to her, but what if he does it again? And she said, let's give him a drink. And I was like, what? Is it college? You can't just give people drinks. What I learned from this family in many years is that people who were you know, engaged in what they call vice-like behavior, acting strange by isolating themselves, we never shunned them for their compulsive dependency on anything. And that actually diffused so much of the situation. So many of it, so when Clemente wanted to be around, he was always welcome. What was worrisome to people is the fact that he took himself away. And this was so different than what was going on in my own family at the time because my sister was an alcoholic, and all we did was shun her. We tried to, my other sister and I were constantly trying not to be a family with her. We were appalled at the way she acted. But the way she acted had so much to do with the way we were treating her, which was like, you're a drunk, you're an alcoholic, you need to get in control of yourself. This built on each other because I think, in fact, she drank because it allowed her to get angry at us. Alcohol was a convenient way to have rage when you can feel somewhat inhibited from being filled with rage without substances. But so I started juxtaposing these things and learning a lot from my neighbors. But then later on, when my sister stopped drinking, which was an enormously hard process, as many of the listeners here would probably know and imagine firsthand. And I was incredibly proud of her, and she did it to Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was amazing. An amazing place for her. Being shamed for the fact that she was dependent on benzodiazepines to help manage her panic attacks, especially after my time in Mexico, when I started really thinking about the way that we're so disdainful of dependency, because now she had put aside, she had been able to stop drinking, which is a thing that if we would use my neighbor's terminology, put her into vice because it disconnected her from it. She would go on the bridge and then we would isolate her. So now she wasn't doing that anymore. And she was taking substances that she was dependent on to not have panic attacks. But still, people some in recovery, other people not in recovery, were constantly treating her for these medications that helped her stay with us, that helped her live in her life, that not have panic attacks. They would call her an addict, or all these kinds of things. And it was um, from all this work I did in Mexico, it just was like, oh, this isn't just about, the fact that the alcohol was causing her to act in a destructive way that maybe also came from us treating her badly, but it's also because we hate dependency so much. We're so sure that people shouldn't be dependent on psychoactive substances. And I think that ended up making me be able to understand what my neighbors were telling me even more. And and I'll end here, and there's so much more to say, but I'll end on this part of the story. What I realized is they were never judging anyone for being dependent on anything. They assumed dependency. That as an adult, you're trying to make as many dependencies as possible on other people, on gods and saints, and on substances that hold you with people. Like drinking together is a powerful process. Doing drugs is a powerful process. Being devoted together to other things that they would say they were addicted to, like this is going to sound weird, selling Tupperware or collecting things. They never paid attention to like what the addiction or the vice was because it could be anything. It's just whether it brought you together in more dependencies or made you isolate yourself for some weird reason.
Yeah, the story of your sister throughout the book was pretty fascinating to read too. And I know the part about the Chicago experience to me, I'm like that just needs to be a reminder for people of how we don't want to treat people because you talk about what it went through and everything. I wanted to ask you because I actually wrote about that when I read books. I always have my questions that I want to ask people.
Oh,
So one thing I did put in here though was I noticed when you would talk about your sister throughout like the first half-ish of the book, there was often like a reference to her like with the alcohol being the big thing, talking about the impact it was having on you and other people.
mhm.
I noticed like towards the later end of the book, you started talking more about her mental health and
Yeah,
everything that she was going through. You were reflecting more of what it was like to be her, not
yeah,
necessarily what the impact was on me.
yeah.
So I started to notice that shift. Was that what was like that, I guess, for you? Is that am I picking up on something or was that
I'm so glad that
entirely
you.
different? Because I just started to
Yes,
see like you're talking about her differently, you're experiencing it differently and seeing her experience that it's easy to say alcoholic, but also you start talking more about what it was like with her anxiety and what
yeah.
it was to just be her or try to be her. And I was like, this is so compassionate and such amazing transformation of, alcoholic, what it's doing to me to know this is what she's experiencing, this is what it's like to be her, and trying to see that and also help in other areas because of what was going on with it. So, where am I with that? Am I close to something? And
You're right on the money. I mean, I think you're right on the money about what we tried to do or what I tried to do with the narrative arc of the book, with the help of a really great editor, where the beginning of the book is the reader hearing from me about how hard it was to live with my sister as an alcoholic. And a thing that I think I can name a little more clearly that's happening in the book, but it's subtle in a way, is that at that point, what I thought was wrong with her was that she was an alcoholic. Like the alcohol was the problem. You stop drinking, you're going to be fine. We need to just focus on the booze. And I do think that that is such a thing that we do in the United States. We are like, people are on drugs and they're having a hard time in life, and that means the drugs are the problem. So if we just get rid of the drugs, the booze, or the whatever, then their problems will go away.
and we say
And
that, right? Like treatment programs say like, hey, go
yeah,
to treatment and everything will
yeah.
be okay. The
And
probation officer says, hey, as long as you stop using, everything's going to be
yeah,
okay. Like that's the gift wrap
yes,
box of recovery.
that is the case. Well, I learned by living from my neighbors who showed me this whole other way, where they're never assuming that the alcohol is the problem. They're assuming that isolation is a problem. Um, that I was able to see how much she was struggling, and then the alcohol allowed her to do something. It allowed her to go into rage, which she wanted permission to do, because she was so mad at how we had isolated her so much, or I had isolated her so much. And then when she stopped using it, all of the stuff remained. Like all of the things she was struggling with, like panic disorder, um, and various kinds of anxiety, depressions that so many people have, and in the United States, and that wasn't really addressed by her getting sober. I mean, it was great that she had gotten sober, but she still needed help, and the benzodiazepines helped her so much, and that she still actually, her life was still so complicated because not just regular people, but practitioners were constantly saying you shouldn't be on benzodiazepines because you're an addict. And it was like, but, and by that point, I was kind of way more on board and understood the kinds of struggles and challenges she had in her life and could really see how this narrative of like, oh, the problem is the substance. So now she was off alcohol, and now they're saying, well, now you have to get off benzos. And it was like, the benzos are the thing that managed to like keep her with us, to keep her close to us. Like they help with the panic in all kinds of ways. And um, I think that that's exactly what I found so powerful in Mexico. It's what I find so powerful in harm reduction movements in the United States, where the focus isn't on you must get clean or we won't help you in some way. There's some really interesting stuff going on with harm reduction therapy now, where the whole point is, this is the only condition that we insist people like cure the condition before they get the treatment. Like, we're not going to give you treatment unless you start using.
Yeah, my
And
one of my supervisors for a long time always said like your substance use is a weird profession because you discharge people upon confirmation of your diagnosis.
and so, but I purposely the exact thing that you notice, like by the end, the book is really about how much of a struggle it is to live in the US where you're shamed constantly for your dependencies, especially if you have dependencies that are not, that are about substances that aren't about becoming a productive working member of society. Like, I mean, we tend to glorify substances that help us work more. And we also glorify some addictions that help us work more. Like, I'm a workaholic. I'm also addicted to things that, like one of the ways that I kind of settle myself is I'll have to have this writing every morning. And if I don't, I feel terrible, like I'm kind of jonesing. And luckily for me, I didn't get shamed for that because, it means that I do more work, which we're prone to be talking about in the United States. Those people who are dependent on things to like make them show up and or not make them, but allow them to be with other people or allow them to make it through their day, we are just those kinds of dependencies. And again, my neighbors were the folks that helped me see like, oh, like you can't just let people have their dependencies, and when they do, they are often much less abusive or estranged or estranged. And so, looking at my landlady and her husband, we had such a, I'm not saying it was perfect, and I'm not saying that, his drinking was totally fine. But again, for her, the problem was the way that he wasn't present, not that he was drinking. And so she was focusing on a much kind of larger set of issues and concerns about why he needed to be alone instead of be with the family.
And I'm fascinated about the whole because you really got me to rethink dependency in of itself because I know the saying that we have is the opposite of addiction is connection, and you talk about addiction is connection. The the reality is I always say like we're social beings. Like
Yeah.
we are social creatures. And it isn't just substance use where we talk about the importance of connection. Like
Oh my
I
God.
work with mental health. I work with,
Yeah.
I work with couples. I work with families and stuff. So like connection, we know is so important. And I also think about, the epidemic of loneliness and isolation that came out Surgeon General a couple of years ago about the impact of it. So then I'm thinking, we say we're social beings and that we need connection but never want to seem to call that a dependency.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
don't seem to want to say that that's a dependency, but we want to tell people you need that. You can't do it without that. Even in like the area of substance use, it's like we hear this all the time. Like you can't do it alone. You need, it doesn't mean you have to go to every type of meeting there is. It doesn't mean you have to go to a specific meeting in general, but who is a part of your network? Who's a part of your support, right? Like that's always
Yeah.
talked about. But yet we don't seem to want to call that a dependency. So my question to you is it seems like we are wired to be dependent. So does that make us all wired to be addicted? Because it seems like that is how part of us is made to be that way. Like we is and but we do try to fight it. There are other people who need it maybe a lot less than we do, but I always say that that's a pretty small percentage of people that
Yeah.
like don't need any kind of social connection. So how is it that we can acknowledge in the same sentence, hey, there's this epidemic of loneliness and isolation. You can't do this on your own. You need others, you need connection. But wait, we can't call it being dependent. Like it seems
Yeah.
like it's a dirty word.
Well, it is a dirty word. So, I mean,
Yeah.
we're to be rugged individuals, and I think have this long-standing fear of dependency. We don't like to call things dependency. So the people that we want to ostracize, we say they're dependent. Like we talk about welfare queens, right? But really, the middle class and rich people get way more government subsidies than anyone who's collecting any kind of social security from the United States. I mean, we get, if you're a homeowner, you're getting all these subsidies, and, tax write-offs and things like that. And those are forms of welfare, they're forms of dependency. Anytime you're using public roads or getting, mail or, go using schools or libraries, these are all forms of social welfare, but we don't like to call those things dependencies. Or, more and more, like, oh, we shouldn't have public schools, they should be charter schools because we don't want dependency. Um, and I think that what was the thing that you were getting at there? One of the things that I think I want to convey in the book is that why is addiction so inexplicable? Like there's a massive industry around trying to find why are people addicts, right? Like what's the root cause? What's the definition? And we don't really agree on the definition of addiction, but we still find it this completely puzzling thing. Like why is it that people are compulsive or over out of control in relation to certain things, whether it's heroin or shopping or gambling? Why is it? And there would be no way to frame that question. Like, if we didn't assume that people have control over themselves, like this would not be such an inexplicable thing. And these early translations of addiction into English are all about that addiction is, a completely normal human experience. We are all have these areas in our life where we're not in control of ourselves. And it's only been since like the 16th, 17th century that we assume we can be in control of ourselves. And what seems to be what makes addiction so hard and devastating is our certainty and our ideology, our sense that we should be in control of ourselves. So it's so deeply troubling when we're not. Many places in the world, people don't assume that you are supposed to be an independent being in control of yourself all the time. And anyone who I think has some kind of relationship to God or saints, they're assuming that they're in control of things. And the reasons why I think AA is so powerful, it's like let go, let God. It's all about not being in control, um, and about fellowship. And those are two things that I found really predominant in the way that my neighbors were celebrating addiction. Like addiction, if you do it with them, it is doing it with others. It is a way of celebrating the obliteration of the self in relation to something larger than the self. And that's just like being a human being. Like anyone who's not doing that is who we worry about. And anyone who's isolating themselves is who we worry about. And there isn't this assumption that people are going to become independent and somehow control themselves in all kinds of ways. Again, we have several hundred years of U.S. history to that helped embed this sense that we are supposed to be in control of ourselves. But it sure would, get rid of a lot of jobs and experts and, you know, a different facility with treatment centers if we, stopped thinking that it was pathological that people weren't in control of themselves.
When I was reading your book, and you mentioned early on the story of with the tequila and the husband,
Yeah,
and when you read book about drugs, I'm really anticipating I'm going to read about like cocaine, fentanyl, I'm going to read about heroin, I'm going to read about all
yeah,
this. And while you do mention substances, I will tell you I did not anticipate to have such a reference to frescoes, right? Is that
refresco,
refresh?
soda.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And I was curious, did that help you see it differently? If you would have focused so much on like the drugs that we always talk about, because when you write so much about that, it helped me see it in such a different way that I don't know if I would have been able to see it in the same sense if we just kept referencing the same substances. Like there's, we call them hard drugs or we call them like the bad ones, and yet there's so many other things that still, are on that list. I don't really like to refer things as like hard or the like it just to me it's I know someone who struggles with one substance more than any other one, and it's
yeah,
you just never know how to explain why. So you spent a lot of time mentioning and
yeah.
observing that. So what was that like for you to see it in that sense versus trying to necessarily look at just fentanyl only or looking at like cocaine only, but you kind of brought it into a light of something where I think it was hard for people to even sometimes go against it because they probably weren't anticipating reading so much about soda.
Yeah. So it's interesting you bring that up in that way because one of the things I'm worried about in the book is that people won't be able to hear what I'm saying about addiction in general, and they'll say, "Oh, she's not talking about hard drugs." And so just to back up for folks who haven't read it, what Andrew's talking about is the way that one of the main addictions people have is to soda, to refreshers. They call them refreshers. And basically, you can't eat a meal without having them. People are drinking refreshers all the time. And they talk about them as addictions. And they would say they're more addictive than what the narcos say. Like, this is more addictive than alcohol, more addictive than um, people, there's a fair amount of marijuana in these neighborhoods, and also what we would kind of the equivalent of glue. Um, and and then I also talk about other drugs in other places around the book, like my sister taking prescription medications and things like that. And I also talk about food and people's relationship to stuff and hoarding. And what I'm trying to get out there is the way that this relationship of compulsivity in relationship is something that's really widespread. And you can see some are worse than another by focusing on substances. Like heroin is worse than drinking soda. And you can argument, and of course, heroin or any opioid definitely, OD is an issue. Not being able to breathe is a real problem, and we've had an epidemic of overdose in this country in all kinds of ways that has been horrible and devastating. And it could feel uncomfortable for some people if I'm equating drinking soda to, opioids. Um, One thing I would say is this relationship of compulsivity is the same, and that feels like I think some addiction experts would disagree with me because they would get into this distinction between psychological and physiological withdrawal. And I contest that a bit in the book and also have a fair amount of other researchers that don't know if they think that that's, the best way to divide things. But when we think about something like the stakes of soda, soda is Mexico is the number one consumer of Coca-Cola products and soda in the world. And soda kills by far more people than any kind of illegal drug or alcohol in Mexico. the deaths from diabetes and cardiovascular disease in Mexico are, staggering, basically. So even though people don't die acutely from overdose, I mean, pretty much everyone or someone they know has diabetes, has relatives that have lost limbs from diabetes, is suffering from some kind of sequelae of diabetes or cardiovascular disease. And yet, so they don't drink water, they only drink soda. And this kind of compulsion and the fact that soda holds people together in these forms of sociality, it's, a preeminent devotional liquid that holds people together, is what I'm trying to convey. And also trying to convey when we think about our own relationships to things that we don't have control over. And, and I think it is useful to think about how it's not necessarily useful to make this division between hard or soft drugs or drugs that will kill you acutely or chronically. um, and I'm glad to hear that it actually giggled your sense of things a bit, because I have run into a few people that are like, how could you equate heroin with soda? And it's like, well, I'm talking about the experience of not being in control of oneself in relation to the thing that they are addicted to.
To summarize why I think that worked so well, at least for me, so I'm just going to speak on me
Yeah,
as a reader and
we
what
can
I do.
only ever speak for ourselves.
It helped me to see it in anyone and
Mhm.
everyone. Like
Mhm.
that's really what it did, because then you mentioned things like you don't stick to just like all of a sudden you do mention like shopping, you mention other things, you mention food, you mention
Yeah, yeah.
so to me, as you were explaining all this, I was able to like see this in almost anyone and everyone instead of just trying to see it in someone who's using heroin or
Yeah,
just
exactly.
seeing it with someone who's using cocaine, which is then what's going to because there's a lot of people who could say that's not me, or I don't
Mhm.
do that, or I don't have anyone like there are plenty of people like that, despite
Yeah, yeah.
how much people do use it. So for me, it helped me to just see all these words that you're educating us on and talking about, see it in any and everyone. Like there wasn't anyone that I would just be like, well, like I guess this doesn't apply to this person, this doesn't apply to that. So to me, that's why it really took me out of how I'm used to seeing it and thinking about it, and not just thinking about it as a sense of someone who's seeking counseling because of struggles with a substance, or they're in treatment because of a struggle with a substance or behavior. But to me, this was far beyond that, in seeing like how this is really anyone and everyone can fit this in some way. So that's why, to me, it really stood out that it wasn't just reading so much about fentanyl or cocaine or amphetamines and
It's
that.
so arguing. It's like, oh, those are those people every day.
Yeah, yeah. So I really appreciate that, and it just made me more interested to be like, okay, I've never really looked at it from this way, from like a the soda perspective, and this is actually going to make me want to really follow and understand it more versus like, well, why are you talking about soda for? I to me, it was incredibly helpful for sure.
Thank you. And I guess I think that really comes back to this question, or what I was saying a little bit earlier about restoring ourselves to this place where we find dependency so inexplicable and so pathological. Like we're sure it's not okay to not be in control of yourself. And by talking about soda, it sounds like it was effective with you to be like, yeah, we're all not in control of ourselves in lots of ways. And from there, you can go on to like, but we treat people differently in relation to how we judge the things they're dependent on. And also, yeah, and that if we ended up thinking more about the phenomenon itself of being dependent on something, not being in control of oneself, what would that do to the way we treated those that we're treating as addicts now, who we are either criminalizing or in this more compassionate way saying, you're sick and you must leave this substance behind. Like what, what? how might we do that just?
So one more question before we wrap up, and this is later on in your book, which was also as a counselor caught my attention because it's in the chapter against mindfulness.
Yeah,
And I know you mentioned some people, Gabor Mate, Michael
yeah.
Pollan. I mean, the names that I'm familiar with and other, clinicians and people are familiar with. And part of it that really stuck out to me was we talk so much about we're social beings, we need each other, but we can't call it dependency. Dependent on something is bad. But also, let's be very real, and this is the quote that I love. There is so much food to eat, booze to drink, drugs to take, stuff to buy. It's also not really what it is with the culture because the culture is almost abundance. It is
Yeah.
almost like, so to me, it's like this is just mixed messages. And then
Yes,
we
that's
we we expect the person to be able to, you need someone, but you can't need people to the point where we call it dependency. And I want you to know there's all this stuff out here that you have to have, but you also must be able to control yourself with it, even
yeah,
though you're going to be flooded with an abundance of it,
yeah.
where it's like this systematic push of things all of a sudden becomes like the individual responsibility.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
and to me, I'm just like, that is just like, how does this doesn't make sense. Like help me understand the messaging we're trying to give to people. And it just those sentences was like, well, no wonder why people are confused. No wonder why we still can't explain how
Yes.
some of this is. So uh, part of it is, well, with this book and people reading it and you talking about it, like where do we begin to get some sense of kind of flipping this upside down? Like if you were to look at this, like what are some things that someone would take away and be like, if we just started doing this or we did a little bit more of this, like you were saying, not like this is a solution to everything or this takes away all the harm of things, but in order to think about like what you wrote about and everything like that, how do you encourage people to do like a simple step or to, when you normally think to do this, maybe think of this. Where do we start with this after reading it?
Yeah. It's a good question because so much of what I'm trying to do in the book is to show readers that it's actually, since we have that it's up to us, is built into our coming from our hatred of dependency. Like, oh, individually we're supposed to fix things. Individually we're not supposed to be out of control. And that was what was so powerful living in Mexico City in these neighborhoods. My neighbors did not think it was up to them. Like they were constantly getting health messages that they shouldn't drink soda or they shouldn't do drugs. And they were like, but that's NAFTA came and changed, it made sugar cheap. That's not even us. That's on other people. Like we're going to drink as much soda as we want and have a good time. And the people I knew in public health were like, "What's for them? They shouldn't drink so much soda." And and others were like, "It's not to us." So one of the things that I joke about a little bit in the book, I think it's still in there, maybe in an earlier version. It's self-help book where I'm trying to help you notice that you don't have to work on yourself. This isn't about you getting better in relation to addiction in some way. Like this isn't a book of like how to walk away from your addictions. It's instead a book about what if you embrace them. And literally in the book I talk about building altars to your addictions. And so that's one step. And that's a step, and you could do it as a person. And in fact, I have. I don't know if your readers actually, or not listeners, see this thing, but my addiction altar is right behind me. And like I literally built it to help me think about how I could actually be devoted to the things that I don't have control over. And I do that, but I also think we could, and it's really hard because we're good little, individual wannabes in the United States. Try to stop thinking it is up to us, or try to stop focusing on individuals as needing to fix the problem. And then the thing that I would do is Yes, how all these loved ones who they just, there's so much shame around them about the fact that they take substances and that they're, and it's like you need to get cleaned up. And the more we can do to just not focus on that single thing and try to think about what is the bigger picture here? What if they did keep doing this? What if there would be ways for them to do it safely? Or what if the substance isn't really the problem? Like, sure, it might, like soda might give diabetes to people in the long run. And my sister's Klonopin use, Klonopin's been associated with all kinds of things in the long term, but we take all kinds of drugs to help us live in the short term. And maybe we could stop focusing so much on addiction as the problem. Instead, like, what are the issues facing people here? And like you said, so much of it is often isolation and not the addiction itself.
Yeah, I always, for a part of my job that I had a little bit ago, like, I had to read often like death reports.
Oh,
Um, and the thing that always stood out to me and a colleague of mine all the time was like they were they were alone.
exactly.
Like how often is that where they are alone
Yeah.
and that could have been preventable, like
Yeah.
that easily. Like there's so many the term supervised sites or supervised consumption
Mhm.
sites, a heavy word in this, especially in the US. But to me, one of the things that I argue is there's too many unsupervised places where
Exactly.
people.
That's what I'm trying to, at one point I called the neighborhood that I live in Mexico City, where people do drugs in public. And not, when I first saw that, it was like, oh my God, this is horrifying. The kids are seeing this, this is terrifying. They're seeing people on drugs, like, hide the children or whatever. And then over time living there, it was like, oh my God, this actually makes the world so much safer for everyone. Like people are doing drugs in public, other people are seeing them, anyone that's having a problem is being taken care of. There's just the density of sociality is making it so that these neighborhoods are like one big safe use site, but in this very non-sterile way. It's just, and people didn't feel ashamed of doing substances, so they didn't have to hide them away. And you're getting at what we could think about doing for ourselves, and it's very hard to tell someone like, stop getting shame about something. You just kind of can't. But if we really examined how we're so scared in ourselves about being out of control, and maybe that's being projected on others when we're so sure that their addictions are harming them, and we could potentially stop shaming other people for it, and not make it so secretive, which makes people be alone.
Yeah, I think it's one way of when someone's alone, I worry more.
Yeah, no,
Like,
exactly. I mean,
and so many things, like not even
yes,
substance
yes.
use, but when I work with, other mental health issues, when I work with gambling and work with relationships, it's when someone's alone and isolated that worries me more than
Yeah,
anything else. Like,
exactly.
that's the
It's,
risk factor.
yeah. Loneliness. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's really that does feel like I'm not a big believer in root causes, like a single root cause, but aloneness I think is a pretty heavy thing there that's shaping a lot of what happens with people, especially overdose death. Yeah.
All right. This conversation could just go on and on. So many
Yeah.
great things about it. But we are at a moment for you to, based on our conversation or anything that you want to let listeners know, what's something that you'd like to leave with them as a final message takeaway?
About shame and really noticing our own shame and the way we put it on others is around addiction and around fears of dependency is something I'd like to emphasize again. To say is professors in the United States are very easy to find. You can just find me online. And I love hearing from people about this and would love to hear people's thoughts about the book. My email, you just do a little Google search and I'm right there. And I get my email. So I love hearing from people. And I really, the reason I wrote this book it's a very different book for me than other things I've worked on before, which are much more academic. And this is, I think, we tried to write it, or I tried to write it in a way that was very readable, and I want to just be in these conversations. And even if people are really upset by the phrasing addiction, I'm interested in talking to you.
Yeah, and we'll have links to where people can contact you and find out where to get the book and everything like that. But I do really want to thank you, Liz, for joining the book In Praise of Addiction, or How We Can Learn to Love Dependency in a Damaged World. It was a really incredible read, and I was really grateful to have you on. I've been doing this work for over 20 years, and it kind of took me on a little adventure of back to what I first learned or thought of when it comes to this stuff, to everything I know now, to diving into the language around it, culture. I don't think we talk enough about culture and impact. And this is like, yeah, this is why cultural competency is a thing. So it was a really fascinating book that was so important for me to read, even as someone that's been doing this for a while. So I really want to thank you for the work you did and just being able to sit here and talk about this.
Thank you so much, Andrew. This is just a great conversation.
Before you go, if today's conversation gave you something useful, something you'll carry into your work or your own journey, I'd ask you to do one thing: leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It takes about 30 seconds, and it's genuinely the most powerful way to help this show reach more people who need it. Clinicians, counselors, people in recovery, they're searching for this exact kind of conversation, and your review is what puts it in front of them. Scroll down the Apple Podcast app, tap the stars, write a line or two, that's it. I read every single one. Thank you for being here.
You've been listening to Talking Addiction and Recovery with Andrew J. Schreier. We're so glad you've joined us and invite you to connect further with the show and these topics at www.andrewjschreier.com. That's AndrewJSCHREIER.com. You can also email us directly at talkingaddictionandrecovery@gmail.com and connect on social media: Instagram at Talking Addiction and Recovery, Facebook Talking Addiction and Recovery Podcast, and Twitter at TalkAR_podcast. To stay connected and never miss an episode, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe. Until next time, friends, let's keep talking addiction and recovery.